Let's do it. Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this AIPPI Pharma Committee webinar. Yes, so there's a speaker and a moderator. I'll just introduce myself, and Brigitte is so kind to introduce herself. Arjan Reijns, partner at Pinsent Masons in Amsterdam, patent litigator for about 20 years now, just a little bit under, but with also a lot of experience in life sciences and therefore also regulatory matters for, I guess, the same period minus 1 year. I started 1 year with the regulatory things. Anyway, with me is Brigitte, and we're going to be talking about the new pharma package. What we're really going to address, I'll address in a bit later when we go through the contents of today. Brigitte.
Hello. Okay, thank you, Arjan. So good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. I don't know where you are sitting. So my name is Brigitte Carion-Taravella. I'm the principal counsel lead for biologics patent support in the IP team for Europe at Sanofi. I'm also involved in a lot of patent policy matters in Europe, and also involved in different IP association and part of the French board of for AIPPI. So I'm based in Europe, more specifically based in Paris, in France, and my work is focused specifically on biologics, I will say. And so that's it. And I will say that the change that we are facing currently in Europe for regulatory exclusivity and also with respect to Bolar, IP, and so on, it's really important changes that we have to take care to define, I would say, internal strategy in a pharmaceutical company. So,
thank you. Now to the mandatory part, housekeeping. The honors bestowed upon me to share this kind of information with you. Questions and comments in the same way as wishing us a good morning can be put in the chat. So, and you can see on the slide there's a little box there. You click it. I know for the people familiar with Zoom, you know how this works. And other people, it's rather intuitive. We'll have a Q&A session at the end. So the webinar is going to have a few topics, and we're going to take some questions at the end of each topic if they are in the chat and if we notice them. And otherwise, there'll be some time after at the end of the webinar, at least after the our part, for a little Q&A. So as you may be able to see, the webinar will be recorded, or is currently being recorded. So you can look at it at another time as well, and there will be a brief survey at the end of the webinar. We would much appreciate your feedback to see whether it's useful that we do these things. That's on the housekeeping. That brings me to the table of contents. So the things we'll be looking at are the new incentive system by the regulatory and market protection or exclusivity. Then we're going to talk about BOLA. We're going to talk about repurposed medicinal products. We're going to talk about antimicrobials, and then as a dessert, we're going to talk about the EU Biotech Act. Just to be clear, to perform a little expectation management, this seminar is not aimed at being a complete, comprehensive guide to the new pharma package. To those who were, I hope that the numbers of attendees will not immediately drop now. I think it would also be rather impossible in the time slot that we have. We can fill weeks on this. Europe's legislative bodies have, so why couldn't we? But that's not the goal of this webinar. So we picked some highlights and some topics that are on top of mind for especially also the industry, and share some insights. And that's what Brigitte has very kindly agreed on doing. So we picked some things we thought would be interesting amidst the information overflow on the new pharma package that has spread to the market. So that's what we'll be doing in the next 40 minutes, pretty much. So that brings us to the first topic of the new incentive system via the RDP and market protection. So first on the timeline. Now we all know that the package has been published in the official journey has been published in a sense. The regulation will enter into force in 20 days after publication, actual real publication. So what we have right now is the text, and we're waiting for the actual official publication and then the subsequent entry into force. Although there is so you can see this for the directive, there'll be a 24-month implementation period. That's also how it stands for the regulation right now. Implementation is not expected before mid-2028 at the earliest. We're waiting for the real publication. Although there is a 24-month implementation period, some regulation provisions will apply from entry into force. It's good to have those on your, at least in view. These are in Article 181 of the regulation, and some important ones there we're going to touch upon, among which the TEVs. So entry into force 20th day, but it's good to see some of the exceptions. That it has all to do with the fact that certain things are rather urgent and can't wait for effect. So that will bring us to the next slide. What are we talking about? So I think we all know the original 8 + 2 + 1, so 8 years data exclusivity for data protection, and then followed by 2 years market exclusivity, and when there's another indication, another +1. The system has been used for the better part of 2 decades, so this is how it has been working. But there's quite some change. There's a negotiated change that developed from much shorter RDPs to now back to 8 years. But what's happened is that it's become a bit more of a modulated or modular stepped a system. So the baseline, the 8 years at least is something that's remained in a sense. So it's 8 years of data protection followed by 1 year of market exclusivity, and then there's a stepped approach on further years of exclusivity, depending on basically the modulation and the acts taken by the pharmaceuticals. So there can be 1 extra year for, actually it's on the slide, so for meeting an unmet medical need, or a conditional +1 for depending on the kind of studies that have been performed and where the application, the first application was filed. So that's an incentive system to pull things towards Europe. So if there's a comparative clinical trial, which means basically not comparing versus a placebo, but with an actual product that's a standard, although that needs to be negotiated with the EMA, how that works. But so in combination with an early application in the EU, then it can be +1. Or if there's a comparative clinical study with a multinational, that's also multinational clinical study, then pull things towards Europe. That's an option for another year of protection. But if a comparative clinical trial isn't possible or appropriate, because there can be those things, then a multinational plus an early EU application will get you the extra year. And there can also be a conditional extra year for a new indication. So that seems similar, but there needs to be a significant clinical benefit, and it can be granted only once per product. So this means that from the original 8 + 2 + 1, there's been a move to the A+1 plus potentially 1 plus potentially 1. And since there's not enough potentialities in that sentence, there's another potential, which is for not market protection, but for data protection, which can be granted via the TEV. And that's something that we'll be talking about later in this presentation again. So it's a modulated system, and it's been quite some changes, and there's been a lot of speculation as to what that means, which brings me to, I guess, the first question to Brigitte, as someone with both feet right in the market. So, how do you think that this transition from an old system to the new system, how do you think that this new system will affect the average exclusivity period in total, like bundling the data and market protections together? How do you think that this will pan out?
Okay. Before to answer to your question, perhaps I will come back a little bit about the shift, I would say, we have currently about regulatory exclusivity. As you said, we shift from an automatic system to a conditional protection. And I think for that, to understand, I would say, why we have this now in the new regulation, we need to keep in mind what was the objective of the European Commission at the beginning. And specifically, one of the objectives, I will not go through all the objectives, but one of them was about equitable access. The idea for the European Commission was to make every patient in all the 27 member states of Europe to have access to all new medicine, I would say, in an equitable manner, I will say. So it's explained why we have such conditional aspects. And it expects also, it's also an explanation, I will say, about the sanction that we may have about non-compliance, because you did not give any information about that, but it's important to think about that, I will say. So back to your question, I will say. It's really an important question. So everything that I said here, it's my own, I will say, personal thinking. It's not about Sanofi, but I think the honest answer is that I think that the average exclusivity period will likely decrease. Perhaps it's not really an issue, I will say, for the big pharma, for a company like Sanofi, but I have in mind much more a small pharma or biotech. And so you have different conditional aspects about unmet medical needs, new indication, perform more comparative clinical trials. But I will say performing clinical trials, comparative clinical trials, it's a cost. I'm not sure that small company or biotech will have sufficient money, I will say, to be invested to do that. So at some point, it will bring company to make some choice. And we have some condition like unmet medical needs. You know that we have now a specific definition for that. Unmet medical needs product, it's about a product where there is no medicinal product to treat the disease, I will say, or you have already a product on the European market, but the efficacy or safety is not enough. Mm-hmm. So you have specific conditions. Perhaps it's easier for a big company to reach that. I'm not sure that it will be the case for other companies. So it means that if you are not able to reach that specific condition, you may lose some exclusivity, I would say.
Yeah, because you go from automatic to conditional, so that means there's hurdles, and those hurdles are costly. That's part of the thing, I guess.
And specifically with all these conditional aspects and also the sanction of non-compliance you may have, and we have clearly no idea how it will be managed at a member state level. You have much more uncertainty, I will say. So you will have to define different. To put in place different strategy depending on what could be if you have to face any issue at one member state level. So it's something that we have to take in mind, I would say. So clearly, one of the objectives of the European Commission was also about simplification, but much more for the marketing authorization process, clinical trials, manufacturing, and so on. But here, clearly, it's not simplification. The things will be much more complex to manage for the pharmaceutical company.
When applying for the extensions, so it's a bit of a shift. So the first period and the second potential period, some simplifications, some
yeah, it's clearly for the last plus 1 year condition, I would say.
Yeah. Thank you for that insight. So after this, as the table of contents said, I need to move this towards the proper slide. We're going to move towards Bolar. A very hot topic, of course, has been since inception in a sense. So I'll give the floor to you on this content.
Okay, thank you. Before to go into details about what is changing about Bolar, I will say something important to keep in mind is that the result that we have about the different legislative process, trilogue, negotiation, and so on, it's a compromise. It's a negotiated compromise. There was and there is still a tension between generic and biosimilars company advocacy for pushing an expansion of Bolar, and on the other side you have innovator company pushing for more incentives and more exclusivity just to get more money to re-inject in research and development and to propose to new medicine for the patient. So it's what I call the yin and the yang, I would say, of the pharmaceutical business, I would say. And it's really important to remember that. It's also important to remember that generic and biosimilar exist precisely because you have innovation, I would say. It's innovation first and then generic and biosimilar. So the new directive tried to find a new equilibrium because there was already an equilibrium, but the idea was to find a new one just to, I would say, take into consideration some differences already existing at the member state level due to the past implementation or the past way the member states implemented what we have currently, or I will call that the whole Bolar, but it's the current Bolar regulation that we have. So you can jump on the next slide, perhaps. I think it's important before to go to the changes, just to focus on what exactly regulatory exclusivity and what is Bolar. It's clearly two complementary tools, but two different ones. Regulatory exclusivity, the purpose is to protect innovators' data, to protect the market access. Currently, we have the easy rule 8 plus 2 years of exclusivity, and the exclusivity is pretty broad. I would say it's covering all commercial activities, and the benefit for that is clearly innovators. And the legal basis, as you know, it's a legal, the European pharmaceutical legislation, and the certainty currently is very high, I would say. I never heard about any litigation to discuss about data or market exclusivity. The current rule, 8 plus 2, it's clear, I would say. The Bolar?
Yeah, there has been some.
Yeah, but not too much, I would say, if you compare to...
No.
So, but for sure, we will have much more in the future with all the conditional aspects, clearly. About Bolar, so it's really a different tool, as I said. Bolar has been put in place. It's an exemption put in place to enable a generic company to be prepared during the patent term and to be able to launch at day one after the expiration of the IP rights, whatever if it is a patent or the ESPC. And the scope right now, it's pretty narrow. The exemption is only covering the regulatory activities necessary for obtaining a marketing authorization from the European Medical Agency. So the benefit here is clearly for generic and biosimilar, and it's it's the legal basis is a patent law. It's really an exception to patent infringement law. And I will say for the time being, the Bollard exemption, the certainty is really variable depending on the member states. And we have already, I would say, a patchwork directly linked to the way a member state implemented the Bollard exemption since the beginning. So the idea of the European Commission was to try to smooth, I will say, the difference that we have currently different member states and try to harmonize things, I will say.
Yeah, and that was required, of course, because there was quite some uncertainty, not only in the way Ebola would work in each member state, but then also the difference between them, and like in the one market situation that we're supposed to be in, that's rather inconvenient.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
And so if you go to the next slide, I just share on the next slide what the current world. No, go back. I think back again.
Oh, it went so far. Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, just I will not to take time on this one, but just you have on the left part the current version of the Bollard exemption. So what we call the old provision, it's pretty narrow, as I said. It's covering studies and trials, and it's covering also consequential practical requirements. So we have already had a lot of, I would say, some litigation about that because it was not a clear wording, I would say. But right now, you have no explicit third-party coverage. You have no mention about what we call HTA. It's about health technical assessment. You have no mention about pricing and reimbursements, no mention about tenders. So it's pretty narrow. If you look at the right part of the slide right now, you have the wording of the revised Bollard exemption. And clearly, it expands to the scope considerably. You have not only now all the activities necessary to obtain marketing authorization, but you have also health technology assessment, pricing and reimbursement approval, and all subsequent practical requirements associated with these activities. So what it means exactly, we will see in the future. So it's really broad, and much more important, it's also covering procurement tender application. And keep in mind that all activities like manufacturing, sales, supply, storage, import, use, or purchase, as soon as it is done and conducted exclusively for the permitted purpose, so it's about A, B, A, C, A, D, including third-party supplier and services provider, they are all protected now by the new Bollard exemption. You can go to the next slide. I do not remember what I put there. Yeah, it's just a summary about all what is covering now the new safe harbor that we have. So you can jump on the next one.
But some language was introduced on that, right? So I think the original plan on what it would cover would be all those acts, but then there was a language introduced as to the patent term, right? Like as long as it doesn't infringe or something. It was there was a compromise text on this.
Yeah, exactly. And as I said just before, you know, there was already a non-harmonized way of managing Bollard exemption at different member state level. So currently, I can just share some information because it's important to understand why we have such a regulation right now. In many member states, for example, there is a pragmatic and sometimes implicit extension of Bollard. I think about the current version of Bollard that we have. Some activities can be tolerated by some member states. It's about HTA dossier, it's about pricing and reimbursement filing. I have in mind the practices that we have in France, for example. It's possible via a specific mechanism that we call the notification mechanism where as soon as a generic company requests to have a pricing and reimbursement or submit a pricing and reimbursement file, it should notify the marketing authorization holder about that. But it's really specific for France. And such kind of activities is not considered as infringing activities, I would say. So it's just a pre-launch activities for the generic company to be prepared, I would say. But clearly, what is outside Bollard, it's the fact that you will negotiate, for example, the final price. And it's clear that you are not able to launch your product before the expiration of the SPC and the patent. And it's clearly part of the current new law that we have. So nothing has changed about that, I would say. But just to highlight that there was already some activities related by some member states. So the idea was to harmonize things, I would say.
Yeah, and it's also interesting that, so on some aspects, of course, the member states still differ. So the process, this is all aimed at the day one launch, but then, for example, in the Netherlands, like the listing that happens is a monthly thing. So it's and that is also not harmonized. But that's we still need things to work on.
Yeah, exactly.
Is this the right slide for you now?
You can jump on the next one, and then we can perhaps go to a Q&A session. Just to highlight what we have already said or exchanged, I will say. But keep in mind that for an innovative company, we may have some impact about IP enforcement with respect to the new wording of Bollard. And I have in mind all preliminary injunction activities. I will say previously, the fact that a company initiate pricing and reimbursement activities or tender participation was really a mean to qualify that activities as imminent infringement, and it was a way to request to a PI, I will say. Now things will certainly change in the future, and court will need to reassess what constitutes exactly an infringing for pre-launch activities, I will say. So we need to keep that in mind. And clearly, the period of pre-expiration will be really narrow, I would say now, for the innovative industry. And we have no information, for example, if industrial scale activities will fall under the safe harbor or not. So a lot of question and uncertainty. And it will be also, I will say, important to follow the implementation way and the transposition of the member state about this new Bollard. We know that we have already a patchwork. We may have a new patchwork on the existing patchwork, I would say. And the degree of interpretation divergence across the member states may really increase. And so wait and see. We will have some answer in the future, but it will take time to harmonize everything, I would say.
There's a few questions in the chat, and I also have before I move there, I have another remark, which is, as I think what you touched upon is interesting in the sense that these are like the Bollard is the exemption on infringement, but you use the term imminent infringement. Like I think we saw that with the UPC as well, the Boehringers and Teva case. It's so if certain acts are not infringing, but can they still be constitute a threat of infringement? Because that's then the question where the conversation can shift. And that's something that Bollard itself by nature is silent on, because it doesn't deal with threats or anything else. It's just what is and is not considered an infringement. So it might very well be, and this is a discussion I had last week, also is okay, so Bollard protects against like certain acts are not deemed infringing, but do they constitute a threat of infringement?
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is something also put in the. I'm going to have a look here. Oh no, in the chat it's a bit different. But this is a consideration.
Yeah, we always to keep in mind what was the objective of the European Commission behind this, and one of the objectives about generic and biosimilar is to allow generic and biosimilar company to launch their product just the day after the expiration of the IP rights. So they tried to bring in the new BOLA exemption pre-launch activities that was considered as infringing activities in the past that may not be infringing activities with the new BOLA, and all the preparation, I would say, around the activities. So the boundaries is not so clear, and just the case law, the future case law will explain what are the boundaries, and perhaps we will have much more guidance. I know that normally the European Commission is to give some guidance about how to implement the new BOLA. So wait and see what will be the guidelines, I would say.
To go back a few slides, because I see some questions in the chat. To first address one. Oh, it moved down. Right, still had some backup. Aaron Brigitte asks. Let me see. First, go back to the previous slide. There we go. Does Article 85 AD allow making an offer for sale during that life of the patent for supply post expiry? If yes, isn't this discriminatory against other industries? Well, I think to go to the heart of this, in the Netherlands we had the old case. I think it was early 2000s, offering for sale. Offering during the lifetime of the patent for delivery after the patent was not allowed because it changed the monopoly during the lifetime of the patent. I think this question is not entirely clear. So where the tendering kicks in, because technically offering is still an active, like normally offering is an act, infringing act. So how that is balanced. I'm not. Yes. So how the tendering works, how that fits in, and that ties in with the language introduced that like I don't have it at the ready now, but there was basically a cutoff. So there's these acts are not infringing, and except if it like affects the certain patent exclusivity.
Important things to have here. It's so clearly the harmonization was a goal, and the directive says that procurement tenders application are covered by the new BOLA, provided there is no sales or marketing during patent protection period.
Exactly, that's it. Yeah.
So that no sale condition is explicit, but we may have some question. But what counts as a sale? I will say, should we have to put some number here? What is the definition of marketing here? So you see, a lot of questions, I will say.
It makes it very confusing, because what is,
And so clearly, we may have, I hope that we will have some guidance with the guideline we are expected from the European Commission. Otherwise, it will be about future litigation, case law, and so on.
Yeah.
And keep in mind that for all of this, you will have a member states implementation. So we will see how also the member states interpret, I will say, the provision.
And another question, I understand that a third-party supplier located outside of the EU will not be under the BOLA exemption. I think that's not necessary. It depends what you're doing.
I will say for that part, you have the SPC waiver. I will say it depends when.
Manufacturing,
the SPC waiver manufacturing, but
But that's only for the SPCs.
Yeah.
And other than that, you're still because this is generic. Like these articles are not based on location. These are acts that are precluded. So in that sense, I think it shouldn't make a difference because it's act based. Thank you for this webinar. I have Anne Boucher. Article 81.2b compromise directive does not cap the maximum to 11 years? Question mark. No, because I think well, yes, there's a cap to 11 years, but there's the plus extra year with the regulatory, so with the data exclusivity via the TEV, and that can be applied in the 5th or 6th year, adding to the first 8 years. but we'll get to that in a bit. Okay, so I think we can move on to the repurposed medicinal products. So there's a new incentive for repurposing of medicinal products with respect to a not previously authorized new therapeutic indication. So basically, a known active substance, and then there's an MA granted for a new indication. Can it get further protection? The answer is yes. So there can be 4 years of protection under Article 84 of the directive, but there's conditions, and those are cumulative, which is adequate clinical and, where relevant, non-clinical studies or tests were carried out, and they need to demonstrate a significant clinical benefit. And the second requirement is that the medicinal product is authorized in accordance with Articles 9 to 12, and has not previously benefited from data protection. So not previously benefiting from data protection, so it's a generic, a hybrid, a biosimilar, or a biohybrid, or 25 years have passed since the granting of the initial marketing authorization. And this is a 4-year protection, and which is only granted once per medicinal product. So this is another way to also keep looking for new indications for known products to see whether there's more in there than originally thought. Then we go on to the transferable exclusivity voucher, a hot topic. A few things to say about that. So in principle, the transferable exclusivity voucher is granted to a priority antimicrobial, and that means that it addresses both a multi-drug resistant organism, and what needs to be shown is that there's preclinical and clinical data that demonstrate, again, a significant benefit. If that can be shown, then a transferable exclusivity voucher, or a TEV, can be granted. And it's not product related in the sense that it can be applied on other products. Of course, there are requirements for that, which I'll get into, so you can see those. So such a TEV can be used only once on a single centrally authorized product. It is applied for use in the 5th or 6th year of data protection, and it can't be used on all products. It has to be used for products where the sales over 4 years were less than 490 million euros. Then there's only a cap number, so right, it's both capped in numbers and in time. So there's a lot of time being spent on these for a good reason, but they're only awarded, like there's only 5 to be awarded in the first 15 years. So whatever comes first, either 5 or 15 years pass, and that's basically a cap. Of course, this is a first trial, so this can be extended by Parliament and Council if experience shows that it's very effective or works very well. Another thing on the efforts to work on antimicrobials in the current stress that we're experiencing as a society is a voluntary subscription model for joint procurement of such medicine. And it's basically aimed at a guaranteed revenue in exchange for supplying critical antibiotics. So instead of a payment per pill, which means it's also high marketing, like buy our product and use it as much as you can. This is a bit of a wrong incentive. It's more about, okay, so we just have a subscription model. We buy this from you. There's no need to increase marketing efforts, and this kind of subscription model should promote, it's a theory, and actually works out that way, prudent use of such medicine, so only where necessary, and it promotes sustainable and a more responsible medicine use, where resistance is an issue. Now, this is one area of the new pharma package that will apply from entry into force. So there's no need to wait for 2 years. As soon as the 20 days pass after the official publication, the thing is the legislation is into force. This will apply. Yeah, so that's also a new big incentive for us to see how that transferable voucher works. Well, like I said, the voucher is granted, but this can be transferred also. Can be transferred once also to other parties. Now, let me have a look here. No further questions. That means I can move on. Then, in extension to this holistic approach on new pharma, the EU Biotech Act on the horizon, because these acts are not to be seen alone with the pharma package, and this is another initiative that requires our attention. And I'd like to give the word to Brigitte for this.
Okay, thank you. So quickly on that slide, just so the Biotech Act, it's a new proposal from the European Commission published last December 2025. We are just starting the legislative process on it, so not too much to share for the time being. So the idea is to have an implementation around 2028, 2030. So it means that keep in mind that the timeline that we have about regulatory exclusivity, we may have the same timelines, but we have to see how things will move forward. Just quickly here, the main objective of the European Commission here is really to improve the competitiveness of Europe versus what we have currently in China, in the US. And so there is clearly a recognition by the European Commission that Europe risks falling behind the US and China, and it's still the case, I will say, and we need to do something. We have a lot of medicine based on biologics. We have a lot of scientists in Europe, but we have some difficulties to transform, I would say, a research or development project into a concrete new medicine for the patient. And so you can jump on the next slide. Yeah. So there is really 4 pillars on the European Biotech Act. And one of the main important pillars, I will say, it's about the XPC extension. What is proposed by the Commission is to extend by 12 months of additional protection the SPC only for biologics. So there is you have a clear information about what is considered as biologics, and the rationale behind that is to recognize that the timeline for developing a biologics is much more longer than for small molecule. It's much more complex also to develop, to manufacture, to put in place clinical trials. So it's a good sign, I will say, a good recognition about the reality for innovative company. The other pillar, very quickly, it's about clinical trials. The purpose of the Biotech Act is also to find solution to accelerate clinical trials authorization in Europe, to put in place a regulatory sandbox, to use artificial intelligence as well to try to accelerate or to perform in parallel different clinical trials. And you have also a manufacturing pillar, and the main purpose is to boost European biomanufacturing capacity in Europe, and is a direct consequence, I would say, of the previous COVID-19 pandemic. And also good news is for Europe to prepare to invest much more and to have some funding available for financing biotech activities. And hence, I would say, access for startup and innovators for that. So you can jump on the next slide. Oh, that's it.
That's it. Thank you. So, so the EU Biotech Act, it proposes a 12-month SPC extension for biologics. So how does this work in the current competitive landscape? So both the US and China are moving faster on this kind of incentives. Isn't Europe already behind on this?
Yeah, you are right. You are right, I will say. And the data is here to, and it's really today a reality. The idea is not to make that reality worse in the future, I will say. If you look at some data, I will say the global R&D investment has declined in Europe from 41% in 2001, I think, to 31% in 2022. You have also a decrease of a drop on clinical trials activities. So I would like to would like to say that it's really a good start for Europe, and it's really encourages to have such specifically the SPC extension. Not sure that it will be sufficient, but it's a good start, I will say.
Okay, good.
And perhaps to refer also, I don't know if you are all aware about that, but last week, I think, AIPPI published a report made by Copenhagen Economics. It's a publication looking about the impact of the XPC extension that may have on Europe, and there is really nice data information here, and clearly having an SPC extension will make the Europe much more competitive in the future. If you look at what we have in the US and China, and clearly, I will say, look at what we have in the US for not for SPC but for the regulatory protection. You have 12 years of protection for a biologic in the US, and it could be an explanation why I would say innovation is working well in the US, and you have a lot of funding as well. So I think it's a good way to try to improve. We are already behind, but yeah, we have some tools here to improve, I would say.
And being behind doesn't mean you should do nothing. So that's also
yeah.
So I rushed through the presentation a little bit because I was worried about time. But since we do have time, apparently, I'd like to go back. One was on the there we go, on the transferable exclusivity voucher. So the question on this is, yeah, how big of an impact or benefit do you expect this incentive to have? You know, it's on a fairly successful, but it's still like a non-blockbuster is the idea, at least. So what kind of impact should we expect from this voucher?
So in theory, yes, you should have an impact, I will say. It's clearly, I will say, such kind of voucher, it's really a joker card, I would say. And what I would say, for sure, I'm working for a company not working in the antimicrobial therapeutic area. So I have no clear view about what can be the interest to have this. But I think the interest that I see is the transferable nature of the voucher. Because you can have an innovative company developing a new antimicrobial, and it could be a breakthrough product that will be very good for the patient, but clearly we have some issue about antimicrobial aspects and in Europe. But we know also that the use of such kind of new product will be very low, I would say, because the idea is really to avoid to have any future issue about resistance, I would say, about antimicrobial. So it will not be used largely, I would say. So not sure that the revenue will be high. But the interesting part is the fact that a company developing such kind of new product can monetize a voucher. And it could be a high value for another company to take the opportunity to have an extension of the exclusivity. It's not an SPC extension, but you have an extension that can be very valuable for other company to develop new.
But it's, in view of its timing, it's a bit of a gamble because you have to apply it in the 5th or 6th year of the data protection period. Well, the expectation, of course, with these kind of products is that they, when successful, that they are immediately successful. Like if they work, that they are immediately successful. So you should have some data as to a thing, but it's not designed for the product that you apply for. So it's you can apply it to any product. So for other products, it's really a gamble. Like where is this going to go? You have a few more years of data protection, and so some market exclusivity, and then hopefully the extra year, because it counts at the end, really, right? But that's where the real revenue is made. How much it's really going to be worth. So I'll just have to see. But I'm curious. Yeah. Especially because it doesn't really relate to the antimicrobial itself. You can just use it for anything and see what.
But I like the idea. I will say it's really a creative idea. I would say.
No, clearly, well befitting the commercial environment. Okay, there's another question in the chat from look at David. Does the EU Biotech Act provide for a stronger protection for know-how and trade secrets?
There is no information about know-how and trade secrets in the Biotech Act.
No, it's also a separate regime. So no further questions. Then I'm going to move on to another question I had on the Ebola, because it does occupy me personally, because I find it so interesting how it's going to be work from now on. I think we already addressed that it's not really clear how the tendering is going to work and how it's going to be harmonized. But let's move on to the third-party suppliers or service providers. So that they receive quite some attention in this new legislation. Was this a problem? Were they targeted so much that there needs to be this legislation on their position?
Clearly, I think the relation with third-party supplier and service provider was in the gray zone with the old BOLA, I would say. So the idea is to fix things. It was really the objective of the European Commission to do that. So I think it's a good thing. Under the old or the current framework that we have, API manufacturer, CMOs, I would say logistic provider as well, or laboratories performing some tests was really in the gray zone. So it's a good improvement, I would say, and good clarification. But we should keep in mind that it's not only a clarification, but it's also an expansion, I would say. Because clearly now you provide a clear statutory safe harbor that simply is not existing currently. So we may have some question, I would say, and again, it will depend how things will be implemented and what will be the guidelines. But we will have to define what will be the boundaries for that, I would say. And today, it's really uncertain, I would say. What degree of involvement is required when you are considered to provide some services to a generic company, or when you will be too far, I would say. So the exact scope of the third-party protection is not so clear. It can be subject also to interpretation by different member states, by court, and so on. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think it might be linked to something you said before with the SPC manufacturing waiver. You know, when you talk about CROs, both CMROs on the manufacturing part, this is, of course, the way in which manufacturing can be done in Europe, disclosing those opportunities here, I guess.
Yeah.
I guess that's part of it, to be consistent with or at least align with the manufacturing waiver, to pull manufacturing towards Europe in a sense.
We'll move on that aspect. But there's some uncertainty here as well.
Yeah. So of course, like any legal text, there's going to be divergence on interpretation. Leave that to people in this business and lawyers and all alike, really. So there's going to probably be some divergence across member states on the implementation. And what would be your personal, so not the Sanofi, but your personal practical advice or views for companies navigating this fragmentation in the member states? Is there anything you have to offer to them?
I will say you should stay update. We will have some new information coming, certainly beginning of 2027 after the official publication and the entry into force. So keep updated about the new information that will come and follow the guidance that we are supposed to receive from the European Commission. And if you can act on the way also the member state will implement the new regulation, it will be good, I will say.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. I think we're reaching the end of this this webinar. I don't think I've missed any more questions. Let's go back to the. Of course, have to direct your attention to the AIPPI World Congress in October. The IP would be wonderful to have all you there, of course.
And I will be there. So
AIPPI marketing.
Yeah, in 2027, just to make some publicity for friends, you are certainly all aware that the AIPPI World Congress will take place in Cannes in 2027.
That is okay.
So it's a good news.
You're not saying skip this one, are you?
No. So at least for the two next one, I will be there for sure.
Okay, and excellent. Okay, well, thank you all for attending. Thank you, Brigitte, for your time and effort in helping us see how this is perceived, how the developments are going. Really great. Thanks for AIPPI for providing the platform, and I wish you all a wonderful day. I'm going to stop recording.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.